Is the golden age of tabletop gaming dead?
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it.
Spoilers. No, it's not. This week, writer and historian Ben Riggs wrote a long screed about the current state of tabletop RPGs, in which he claimed that a golden age of tabletop RPGs is passing away before our eyes. Riggs's assertion was that the hobby-wide shift away from Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition was a sign that the industry has peaked and was about to enter a decline. But recent developments make clear that this radiant golden age is ending as surely as the steam engine ended the age of sail, or hobbits bearing a ring ended the third age of Middle-earth, Riggs wrote on social media. Never mind that those were all positive advancements, unless you like the idea of living under the terrifying gaze of Sauron. Riggs's assertion is that the current wave of tabletop RPGs, many of which were spawned or accelerated by the OGL crisis of 2023, will splinter the industry to the point that sales will decline across the industry. It will make it harder for new designers to break into the industry, and it will make it harder for companies to attract new customers. Now, Riggs's claims are riddled with inaccuracies ranging from Critical Role dropping Dungeons & Dragons. Spoiler alert, they haven't yet, and it's likely that they're still going to have some sort of D&D presence, even if their core campaign moves to Daggerheart sometime in the next few years. To Matt Colville's shift away from YouTube, something that's been happening for years, as Colville has spent more and more time developing MCDM products and running a business. To talking about Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition that's supposed to come out next year. While it's kind of easy to forget, the 2024 core rulebooks aren't a new edition of D&D. It's 5th edition with errata and performance enhancers. However, even putting aside all these factual inaccuracies, I still take issue with the core assumption that the OGL crisis and other missteps by Hasbro in 2023 has somehow threatened the industry as a whole, when in reality it caused a de-emphasis of 5e in certain spaces. First and foremost, we are living in a golden age of tabletop RPGs. That was clear when tabletop publishers started raising millions of dollars on Kickstarter and other crowdfunding platforms. While we had $5 million or more Kickstarters in the 5-year period between 2016 and 2020, we got 10 projects that broke $1 million in 2023 alone. And that's not counting Matt Colville's MCDM RPG, which, is still ongoing. That'll be the first one for 2024. And while a lot of those successful Kickstarter projects were made for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, the two biggest tabletop RPG crowdfunding campaigns of all time, Avatar Legends, which is a Powered by the Apocalypse game, had nothing to do with 5e, and Gloomhaven, which uses a bespoke system, also nothing to do with 5e. Other notable non-5e projects include Old Gods of Appalachia, the Magnus Archives, The One Ring, and Monty Python. Now, one could argue that a lot of those projects succeeded because of the power of an established brand, and that's true, and we'll actually touch on that a little bit later in this video. But all of these big projects are also proof that a lot of people are willing to spend money on tabletop RPGs, and we haven't seen any sign of that stopping soon. Once again, MCDM just raised $4.5 million to make a very specific kind of fantasy tabletop RPG. We're about to get a Stormlight RPG that's going to do bonkers money. Keep in mind that Brandon Sanderson, he broke Kickstarter records just over a year ago. And that's not even counting stuff that we don't have firm metrics on, like the Marvel RPG or Critical Role's RPG projects. We don't know how they're doing, but they're probably doing pretty darn good. This all leads to my next point. Any decline or de-emphasis in D&D 5e is far from a guarantee that the tabletop RPG industry as a whole will decline as a result. Riggs is right in that a lot of people made careers out of making material for 5e, and that game was at the heart of a renaissance of sorts for Dungeons & Dragons. However, even when D&D was at its lowest, there were other tabletop RPGs that were thriving. Pretending like D&D is the only game in town ignores all of the people whose first tabletop RPGs were Vampire the Masquerade, or Pathfinder, or Legend of the Five Rings, or Rogue Trader, or one of a million other games that existed independent of how D&D was doing that year. To be clear, certain tabletop RPG publishers and designers have thrived because of 5e. But even before last year's OGL missteps, there were already signs that other trends were emerging in the industry that people were taking advantage of. Most notably, the rise of these games that are built around established franchises. Now, this isn't exactly a new concept. If you lived through the 2000s, you probably can remember the glut of D20-based games that came out that were all licensed. But a lot of folks are looking at established franchises now and wondering how they can turn it into a tabletop RPG. And this time, unlike, back about 20 or so years ago, a lot more designers aren't making those licensed products using one system. And that's honestly a sign of a much healthier industry than, say, the D20 boom. The industry is filled with a lot of savvy people who are going to keep making great games and products and figure out ways to stay in business. That has nothing to do with Dungeons & Dragons. Maybe 5e made it a little bit easier, but a lot of those companies were already around and making products and making good products before 5e existed. And honestly, all of this isn't even touching on other parts about why we're living in this TTRPG golden age, such as the ease to access tabletop RPGs made in other countries. Like, we finally got a translated version of Dragonbane last year. I just came across the Demon Slayer RPG in a comic book store, and the Die RPG is wonderful, and I'm sure I'm forgetting RPGs from a dozen other countries. All of this stuff is much easier to access thanks to a shrinking world. Hey, the internet is great for stuff like that. Also, one side note, I also kind of take a little bit of umbrage with the concept that D&D is in some kind of decline. Now, we have criticized Dungeons & Dragons a lot on this channel, and for good reason. But for all the Hasbro nonsense that happened last year, pretending as if Baldur's Gate 3 hasn't inspired like 1 million people to either play D&D for the first time or to start playing D&D again is kind of ridiculous. When you fixate on the day-to-day stuff, you tend to forget that D&D is still like a megalith in pop culture right now. Last week, I saw an entire display of D&D stuff at Target. That game isn't going anywhere, regardless as to whether Critical Role or Matt Colville or anyone else is promoting that game. It's doing fine. In fact, Dungeons & Dragons posted record sales in 2023, despite all those Hasbro-related PR disasters. Record sales in a year where their own corporate leadership kept repeatedly shooting them in the foot. So acting like they're heading for some sort of financial downfall is just blatantly disregarding their actual impact on the market in 2023. So to summarize, we are living in a golden age for tabletop RPGs. It probably isn't the only golden age, but it's definitely a high point. However, good chunks of the industry have already moved on from 5e, long before the 2023 OGL mess. Trying to claim that 5e is solely responsible for the current success we're seeing is wrong-headed. It's one part of the picture, but it's not the whole damn painting. And more importantly, D&D's success, either as a brand or a game, won't be the only deciding factor as to whether tabletop RPGs continue to thrive. I think the more good games we have, the more successful tabletop RPGs will be. And right now, we live in an era where there are a hell of a lot of good tabletop RPGs out there, and that's great. Okay, so that's my rant. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section, and as always, don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons.